welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
In a New York Times op-ed on December 15th, 2011, you wrote a piece in which you state, a mere 1% of Americans own just under half of the country's financial assets and other investments. America, it would seem, is less equitable than ever. But at another level, something different has been quietly brewing in recent decades. What is that that's been brewing?
Well, what's interesting, and again, the press doesn't cover this, is just below the surface of what the press normally sees. There are thousands and thousands of institutions that democratize the ownership of wealth. Systems, political economic systems, are defined in terms of their power by who owns the capital. And if 1%, and it is in the United States, 1% owns just under half of the investment capital, 5% owns 70%. Literally medieval power structure, literally. So if there's to be an alternative, and a democratic alternative, what you look for is, are there ways that democratic ownership can happen? And indeed, if you look closely, there are some 13 million people involved in one form or another of worker-owned companies, a form that changes who owns. There are 130 million people involved in credit union and co-ops, another democratized form of ownership. There are 4,000 or 5,000 neighborhood corporations, which is kind of devoted to neighborhood development. There are 2,000 utilities that are owned by cities. People don't realize that. A quarter of the American electricity supply is essentially socialized in a radically decentralized way. Utilities and co-ops, city-owned utilities. So just under the surface, and it's been growing, there's a whole quiet building up of a different model that has a very American tone to it, but goes at the central question of who owns capital, who owns the wealth, and that I think is a critical basis for possible longer-term change.
And what do you mean by a particular American tone?
Well, unlike France, for instance, or Russia or the former Soviet Union, we have a very decentralized tradition. It's localism and states and a kind of participatory American idea that comes from the agricultural frontier days. So there's something in the culture that is, it can go many different ways. It can go far to the right, to individualism. But it also has a community spirit and a kind of, you can do it, roll up your sleeves, we can try something here. And the models that are interesting, and I think of this as long historical development, are very much at the local, neighborhood, workplace level of democratizing. And I see that, one, as a precondition of how you could actually develop a system which was not state-dominated, but also change who owned the productive capital. And that's a precondition, building up that kind of experience, culture, and also vision, models of what would be. It's also, in a funny way, it has a Gramscian aspect because it cracks open in a very American way the ideological question. That is to say, it opens up the question of who owns capital in a practical way rather than a challenging way. That's another question. The challenge part is needed. But here you have ordinary Americans doing worker-owned companies. What are we to make of that? Why not? And why can't that expand?
And you write further in the Times that if such cooperative efforts continue to increase in number, scale, and sophistication, they may suggest the outlines, however tentative, of something very different from both traditional corporate-dominated capitalism and traditional socialism.
That is what's interesting about this to me, because, I mean, at one level, this is all very positive. It's all useful, and it's helpful, and it's a good thing to do. But much more interesting is whether or not these kinds of developments, if we are aware and self-conscious and clarify the meaning, give people a sense and even an ideological perspective on what might be possible. Recreating a sense of the possible and a sense of vision and something beyond rhetoric, something that gives content to an alternative structure of beyond corporate capitalism and beyond the traditional state socialist models. You need to have that if you're to build a movement that gets beyond rhetoric and also has something concrete to do and say. So yes, I see it as both useful to do no matter what, but also laying down ideas and practices and experience and expertise of how actually do you do a good worker-owned company. Not rhetorically, but And what are its limits? There are problems with worker-owned companies too. Getting much more sophisticated about what it is we want and what it is that makes sense.
And you warn that these efforts, or you realistically observe that these efforts are minor compared with the power of Wall Street banks and the other giants of the American economy. Are they willingly going to go along with the weakening and evisceration of their own power?
No, of course not. Of course not. The struggle for real triumph over the systemic issues is a many-decade struggle. So if you say now is the fight tomorrow, it's obvious that the deck is stacked, and if that's where the confrontation comes, that's not going to happen. On the other hand, if you take, I wear a hat as a political economist and historian, but if you stand back and ask, how does historical change really take place? What you're looking at is decades of developmental struggle, both negative, challenging, and the creation of ideas, projects, vision, concrete ideology. What I think is interesting is the failures of the American system. And I think they are endemic now. I don't think they're going to go away. I don't think the pendulum's going to swing. I think we're into deep stagnation and decay and pain. That is the forming ground of people waking up and saying something is profoundly wrong, not just who wins the next election. Occupy had it was interesting. They cracked open a debate about 1% and the 99%. But that would not have happened if people didn't feel there was something wrong. Much more important, even than Occupy, is that there's a sense in the public something's wrong. So I see it as a long, long battle and a long developmental process. Another way to look at it is, and we've been doing a fair amount of work in some of the parts of the Midwest where the destruction of cities is just powerful. That's the internal empire. And at the tail end of the internal empire, the pain is greatest. But it's also the place where people are struggling to build something new. So if you see it historically, you can even see it in traditional terms. Many of the preconditions of even the New Deal were developed in the states and localities, some of them state by state, decade by decade. The women got the vote in the 19th century, decade by decade by decade, one state and another state and another, until finally they accumulated enough power to go national. And I see the process. This is the prehistory of a possible transformation, not the history of it. So this is where one other way of saying it, my heroes, and I write this in America Beyond Capitalism, my heroes are the civil rights workers in Mississippi in the 1930s and 40s. That's when the real work was done, laying the groundwork and building up ideas and people and inspiration that ultimately could become the 1960s. And that's the hard place. And I think something roughly analogous is the way I think about this period.
In America Beyond Capitalism, to reinforce what you said about Americans in large numbers feeling that something's not quite right, you write, repeated studies have shown the majority of Americans know full well that something fundamental is going on with democracy. And I'm interested here that you put democracy in quotes. I'll ask you to explain that in a moment. And 4 out of 5 judge that government leaders say and do anything to get elected, then do whatever they want. And another study found that 7 out of 10 felt that people like me have almost no say in the political system.
It's interesting, not only is that now true, that people sense that and they know money is dominating, and even more so with the Citizens United decision, that people understand that. But what's very interesting, and again, if you're thinking about transformative change in stages and development, 3 decades ago, the numbers were just the opposite. If you ask somebody, what do the politicians, will the president, will the Congress do what people say? And they say, well, of course, they do what the people say. So there has been a major ideological shift, consciousness shift, negative in this case. Something is wrong, it's all rigged, or Washington is broken, or whatever the language is, or 4 out of 5 saying they'll just do anything to get elected. That is a profound, more important in the shift, profound sense of direction, of understanding in the ordinary public. You can't get to much more fundamental change until you eliminate the possibility of believing in some of the foolishness. And that's going on big time in the United States. People sense there's something profoundly wrong. They don't quite know what to do with it. They're still struggling with that. But awareness has grown over my lifetime in a way that's astounding.
Now, you suggest that these efforts toward building some kind of alternative worker-owned structures will take many decades, that we're now in the incipient stages. Am I summarizing correctly?
It may, not only worker ownership, municipal ownership, that was the early part of the Debs revolution, was about municipal ownership and neighborhood development, all forms of changing, not just worker ownership. We are potentially in the incipient stage. We're further along than that. There's a lot on the ground when, as I say, 130 million people are involved in credit unions and co-ops. A very American institution that doesn't get taken seriously, except all of a sudden, $4 or $5 billion have been shifted from big banks to credit unions as a matter of ideology, a matter of saying we don't want to be with the big banks. Let's go there. And some cities now are saying, why can't we set up a city bank or a city credit union? The state of North Dakota's got an old state public bank, publicly owned banks. In San Francisco, they have about $2 billion in regular float cash around. Why should that go to Bank of America? Why not put it in a city bank? Why not set up a city or a credit union? So there are all kinds of, worker ownership is part of this, but there are all kinds of models that are emerging quietly that the central principle is democratizing ownership in one form or another from my point of view, as the preliminaries to the transformation or to an America beyond capitalism.
You trace the origins of this movement, as it were, to actually a failed effort in 1977 in Youngstown, Ohio. A big steel plant closed down, 5,000 workers lost their jobs. You were involved in an effort then to get that plant going again. It didn't succeed, but from those efforts, other things evolved, the Cleveland model.
Yes, and I mean, many of these things have grown up on their own. The industrial worker-owned co-ops, that's very interesting and does trace back in part to the Youngstown. There are many other routes we could go into. But, this was in 1977. 5,000 people lost pink slips in one day, thrown out of work. And in 1977, that was really big news. That was national news because it hadn't been happening. Now it happens all the time. So the steel workers there in Youngstown, it was Youngstown Sheet and Tube, a big company, said, why don't we take this place over and run it ourselves, along with the religious leaders of the city, the ecumenical council. And so that was the original idea. And I was called in to try to help them design a plan and a strategy to do it. And what happened was they did their politics very carefully. They got the whole state, all the Democrats and the Republicans, including the so-called conservative governor, who had to be for it because the religious leaders and labor was for it. And they put forward a plan, which would have made for a worker-owned company, a large one. They even got the Carter administration in those days to commit $200 million in loan guarantees. After the election of, I think, 78, the money disappeared. There's a story there, too. But nonetheless, it was popular. So the mill did not happen. But what was interesting is that the leadership understood that might occur, and they understood, and this is critical for activists now, they were self-consciously aware that even if it failed, they were injecting an important idea into political consciousness, and that they couldn't lose. And indeed, what happened in Ohio is there are probably more worker-owned companies now per capita in Ohio than perhaps any other state. There's no study on that, but you get a sense of that if you go out there. And a little center was set up at Kent State, which began giving technical assistance to worker-owned companies. And over 30 years, there's been a development. There's the most sophisticated model that exists is in Cleveland. And it's a very interesting model because it's in a very poor area, a black area. 18,000 is the family income average in this area, 40% unemployment. But there are also big hospitals there, Cleveland Clinic's there, and there are big universities there. Now, we put two and two together in this case, building on the ideas of worker ownership. Those hospitals and universities And what's really interesting, this can be done anywhere. And in fact, many cities have picked up on this. Any place, if you really think about it, they buy $3 billion in goods and services every year. $3 billion. That's in addition to salaries and construction, just buying. None of which have been bought from this area. So the light bulb went on. Why not see if we can either induce them or ask them or force them to buy from worker-owned co-ops in this area that will service them and also service other things. So the result is, in that area, there are a series of worker-owned co-ops, and they're not simply to make a couple workers rich, or not rich, but make a lot. They're linked to build a community. So they're in a nonprofit corporation, ties them together. They can't be sold off without major decision. There's a revolving fund so that the money is made, percentage, 10% of profits go back in to make new companies, so that they want to build a complex of community building in a structure also of worker ownership, and partly stabilized by the fact that these big hospitals and universities, taxpayer money, a huge amount in healthcare and in education, being used to reconstruct the community on a wholly different institutional design in America right now. And indeed, the small businessmen like it. It helps the tax base, and it has ideological resonance in a way that what we've learned there is that if you speak concretely and make sense and know what you're talking about, quite very, very different fundamental institutional change can be made available in cities, particularly where the pain levels are growing and deepening. Cleveland's gone from 800,000 to 400,000 in the last 30 years. Devastated. It's like Detroit. Nothing has happened that works. And if something like this works, and this is working, there are several companies we can talk about, they have a possibility of reaching a much broader public, which is critical, not just the small radical groups, much larger public. So, for instance, they're just about to open a greenhouse, partly solar, hydroponic, but the scale is not your little co-op. 3 million heads of lettuce a year is the production, plus a lot of other stuff. They have an industrial scale, very advanced, high-tech laundry, ecologically the greenest in the Midwest, perhaps, uses about a third of the water and heat for laundries, servicing the hospitals and the nursing homes in the area. They have another solar installation company, which is on track to put in, just probably shortly, more installation in Ohio, and more capacity than exists in the whole state already. So the goal is to build up not your little tiny corner worker co-op or a co-op. It's to really get serious about developing scale and power and community, not worker ownership, but not just worker ownership, community development in the largest sense of the community.
Talk about the role, historical and presence of organized labor. You trace in your book the steep decline from a peak of around 35% of the workforce being unionized in the 1950s to what it is today in single digits and dropping. And I believe somewhere you cite an expectation that it's going to drop even further by the year 2010.
Right.
What role, historically, unions were a countervailing force to capital?
Right. Well, this is critical. I mean, the way in which most of the advanced systems around the world have been run, and to say nothing is different in other parts of the world, is you allow the corporations and the capital owners to have the dominant role, and you built up union power as the basis of some form of progressive political coalition to keep distributional questions, social questions, environmental questions sort of in line. That's the social democratic model in Europe, or liberalism, or progressive politics in this country. And that's the model. The countervailing force was what Galbraith called it. And indeed, without that, the situation would have been dreadful in most parts of the country and in many parts of the world. That system model, I think that entire design of how you run a system, I think that's decaying before your eyes, for better or worse. And a lot of pain associated with that. And the reason, the most fundamental of the reasons is that the power of labor, organized labor, the muscle and money behind democratic elections, has radically declined from 35%, 34.7, I think it is, in 1952, to just under 12% now, and probably declining further. So even the fights in Wisconsin, I'm from Wisconsin, and the battle in Wisconsin and in Indiana recently and Ohio, very inspiring fights. But the thing to notice is that they were all defensive. They're trying to say, they're moving backwards, saying do less, don't hurt us, don't take away more. They're not on the offense. And the reason, and they would love to be, to gain more power for both the unions and for social programs and economic programs. But there is a decaying process at work. So either there is going to be a new model of how you transform advanced systems in a new direction, or the decay will worsen and the pain will grow and the violence will come with it. So it is absolutely critical at this point, and I think this is the most important period of American history, bar none, and that includes the American Revolution, because we're running out of options in the traditional models. And the question that's posed by all these experimentation and many other things, and by Occupy, is whether we're in the potentially beginning of really reshaping our idea of where to go and how to get there. And critical to that is to get beyond rhetoric to what does it look like? What is it that makes sense in the design and politics and vision of the next system? And all these experiments on the ground, there are many, many more, some of them larger, some of them smaller. Alaska gives away the oil. If you go to Texas and Alaska and see what they do to oil, for odd reasons, Alaska gives every citizen a right to a share of the profits from oil, and oddly, historically. But there it is in America, that odd pattern. If you look deeply, there's lots of elements that begin to form a mosaic, I think, potentially suggesting the direction of an America beyond capitalism and also beyond state socialism, a decentralized democratic model that begins to give content to a different vision and practical experience to build towards it. So I think this is extremely important development, and potentially when it gets a politics. It doesn't have a politics now. It has development, experimentation, and fragment. I think the next stage is a politics that begins to pick up on the knowledge and the experience and the practicality of all of this, and begins to offer answers that they can explain, answers you can explain to anybody. I'm from Racine, Wisconsin. That's kind of a decaying industrial town. I can go back to Racine and talk to my conservative high school buddies, and there are some really conservative, but very intelligent, but very conservative, and talk about all this, and it makes sense to people. It is explainable, developed, and it has a vision that people understand that's a good thing to do. We've got a lot of pain here in this town. So that content, as well as the vision, I think is very important. And it centers on, the name of that book was Capital. It centers on who owns the power base.
People like Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky would say that socialism has never really been tried, that the Soviet Union was in fact a distortion, an aberration. They took the name socialism in its Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, but it was a form of top-down state capitalism.
Yeah, that's definitely, I think, fair. And indeed, I think it's also true that you can find libertarian socialist theory and communitarian socialist theory, and also syndicalist socialist theory. So there are traditions you can draw upon, but for the most part, we've dwindled to the place that socialism means for most people the state owning and controlling. So whatever the rhetoric, and I was a student of Bill Williams, who was always down on rhetoric. He was interested in content.
The University of Madison historian.
Yeah, the wonderful historian at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, a wonderful historian. What does it look like, and why should this work any better is the question we need to ask. And indeed, you mentioned Howie Zinn and Noam Chomsky, both of whom friends of mine who kind of have been urging this book because it gets very practical about where to go and how to begin to build, as well as theoretical about what are the conditions I mean, a lot of the book is simply reporting on what's out there that the press does not cover, that is all over the country, that you can do in your community. If they can do it in Cleveland, Ohio, you can do it anywhere. And then the problem becomes, what are you willing to do? It becomes existential. You want to do something? It is not that it is impossible. We know that from all the things that I report on in the book, or the cities like Cleveland. It's whether people get off their chair and begin to act. So there's an existential component to this, as in all movements. Whether you take this kind of information, and unlike 30 years ago, when we're talking about Youngstown, when to build a worker-owned company, there weren't many people you could call and ask, how do you do it? That's changed. It's a massive historical evolution when we have people available who actually know how to do this kind of thing. And they exist. You want to do any of the developmental trajectories that we're talking about, you just get online or look in the book. There's a website I should mention, community-wealth, put the dash in, simply surveys this kind of thing. And you can find people who can say, hey, we're doing it this way here, and we'll be happy to help you if you want to do something. So that's the challenge in a democratic system. It becomes not just about what they're doing, but what we are willing to get off our chair and do, because now if it is possible to do things, the ball is in your court, right, or in our court. And one never knows about historical development. All of this may decay, possible. But we certainly know if you don't build, you're never going to get anywhere. So this developmental trajectory is very interesting from that perspective as well.
The United States, as well as much of the world, is experiencing the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression of the 1920s and 30s. There's well-documented studies of the tremendous, almost spectacular increases in wealth and income inequality, massive unemployment. Curiously, as economist also Richard Wolff points out, this unemployment is unusual because it involves chronic long-term unemployment. People were out of work for long periods of time, and many of them drop out of the workforce. So this kind of background, I see several possibilities. One is a fertile time for alternative points of view. Look, this is what this system has produced. But also there's a worry that, to use Bertrand Gross's term, the growth of friendly fascism, scapegoating immigrants and gays and that kind of thing to explain the crisis.
And civil liberties. And the president just signed into law provisions that allow some bureaucrat to put you in prison without trial. Maybe they'll get taken out in the next legislation. But there's been no violence yet. A little bit of violence, and you can see civil liberties go out of the window in the United States as they did in the 20s or in the McCarthy era, and even worse now with terrorism. So I think Gross was right. I think that one of the, you can lay out the options. One of the options is that decay will simply continue. Rome decayed, period. Another option is it will explode into violence, and with violence, suppression, and loss of civil liberties or friendly fascism. Certainly a possibility. A third option is the basis of a great transformation will be established in the coming decades. Now, it's clear that no one knows what can happen, but it's clear where the action should be. That is to say, build as strong and powerfully and as intelligently as we can in the new direction, and then see what happens. One of the really important things I think that we tend to ignore about the United States, and I use that language about the internal empire. This is a very large country, and there are lots of places locally that things like the global empires, things can be built locally, slowly in ways that build up over time. And it allows for the rebuilding of local politics and local people who learn to become leaders in doing. It's unusual in that. The scale question, let me say a word about this, because I think a lot about scale these days. Bill Williams always thought about scale. the architect of the American Constitution, James Madison, formulated the problem first in exactly the way Karl Marx had said. Politics depends upon who owns property, and the people with property need to control. And secondly, you got to keep the people without property, without capital, out of the game. He also said, and this Marx, Marx didn't have it this clear as Madison did, that if we can build a very large country, we can keep dividing and conquering. That's straight Madison in Federalist 10. The larger the sphere, we can keep the people without property from ganging up. You can drop Germany into Montana. People don't realize that the scale of the United States is radically decentralized and very different. In Germany, you can build a polity much more easily, a social democratic polity. Here, it's different. Conversely, at the external parts of the society, lots of things are possible in a decentralized way that can build up over time. And lots of initiatives are taking place, and that possibility also exists. We all have a vested interest in pessimism. I mean, if you're pessimistic, you don't have to do anything. If you say maybe there's a shot, then the responsibility is basically on our shoulders. So since we don't know, and since I see as a historian, revolutions are as common as grass in world history. Things radically change over time, and we'll see. The task now is obvious, that laying groundwork and building a base and understanding more clearly what makes sense. I want to emphasize that because I think what's really interesting, if you get beyond rhetoric to really what makes sense, like this design question, you can talk to a lot of Americans about it. They may be scared off by some things, but they're not scared off by, you tell me how it's going to work. Really? And they're not scared. Look, you probably get the Tea Party willing to nationalize the Wall Street banks. The anger is building up. And we were talking mostly local. But, the next big financial crisis, and everyone knows there's going to be another, experts left, right, and center know there's going to be another financial crisis because they can't regulate these guys. One of these days they're going to say, take them over. And indeed, in Citicorp and AIG, Bank of America, probably the U.S. government, had it wanted to, it could use its power already, instead of giving it back, because we put so much taxpayer money in, to have a controlling share. I think that part of it's also going to happen. And we did nationalize two big Chrysler and GM. So there's other levels of the crisis. But the thing that I think is most important, if we're to have a democratic system, is the rebuilding of local experience and individuals locally learning how to do this in a democratic way as the precondition of any kind of system.
A theme you keep referring to, coming back to in America Beyond Capitalism, is American values, and you talk about liberty, equality, and democracy. I just want to get underneath that a little bit because it seems that there's a huge gap between the historical record and the historical fact.
Oh, indeed. Indeed. If you look at the way democracy has been practiced and the destruction of liberty, and certainly inequality, there is a great gap between the ideals and the practices. What is interesting about this time in history is that all the trends are going south. That is to say, inequality is getting worse and worse, and at a certain point, that's why Occupy, as we said, was so successful. People sensed it. At a certain point, people say, hey, there's something really wrong here. Partly because we proclaim ourselves as a society that cares about equality and democracy. At a certain point, when the trend, something breaks. And I think that's what we're seeing. In terms of liberty, it hasn't yet broken. There's awareness that there's a danger. But in terms of the trends on liberty, you can talk about in terms of civil liberties, where there's been a narrowing, and that requires you to get into the law and the Constitution. But the simplest test of liberty in any system is what percentage of the population is put in prison. That's how you take people's liberty away. It's the first place to look. And this country is 7 times as many per capita as all the other advanced industrial systems are in jail, large percentage of which are black people. Something going on that is changing what actual liberty is, to say nothing of technical aspects of civil liberties, which are also going south. So there is a an erosion of the value base. And that has a way of proclaim liberty, democracy, equality often enough, and then begin to destroy it. People begin to say something is profoundly wrong here. And that's the precondition of really fundamental change. And I think that's where we're going. And I think we're all, in many areas, that's where we are. So this is an extremely important period. It's not just the next election or some pendulum swinging.
Is that why you put democracy in quotes?
Well, I think that is why, because the real democracy, genuine. We were talking earlier the day that there's the red mayor of London wrote a book saying if democracy allowed you to achieve anything, they wouldn't let you vote. They wouldn't let you vote. And so meaningful democracy would be.
And then the U.S. version of that, if God wanted us to vote in elections, he would give us candidates.
Right. Well, that is to say, what is a meaningful electoral process really gives choices and power and sufficient power to actually make the choices real. Right now, it's almost a joke in the way in which politics in the primaries is going, and it is a joke. That is to say, the money is so powerful and so important how much gets on television, and so has nothing to do with democracy. It has to do with very large amounts of money competing for the airwaves. And as we've seen the ridicule of this, Stephen Colbert, and doing this, and he's doing it in a very brilliant way because he's saying this is totally fraud, and everybody knows it. It's not like this is, 10 years or 20 years ago, it wouldn't have rung true. Now it's obvious. So the shift in ideology, or the decay of ideology, the decay of consciousness, the loss of belief in the standard nostrums, is a critical precondition. You got to get it out of the way, the old ideas, before you can begin to really take seriously the next direction. And that's happening right before your eyes.
Let me stray a little bit from the actual topic of America Beyond Capitalism, but ask a related question, and that's about imperialism. And the United States, with its string of bases around the world, with its massive military force, is democracy and liberty and these values that we've been talking about compatible with empire abroad?
No. I mean, I come at this book. The reason I got to this book started with American imperialism. And in particular, it started with the atomic bomb and the bombing of Japan. And I wrote 2 books on that subject, asking why was it that this culture was able to kill that many people, knowing that it was unnecessary. And we now know that they knew that it was unnecessary, that the war was about to end, and they knew as soon as the Russians came in, that shock would end the war well before there could be an invasion. That's what drove me. And then that takes you to the question of why systems expand in either formal colonialism or informal empire, the American kind. The questions we were talking about William Epperman Williams and his work on that. And essentially, the source of this, in my view, is an expansionary system, a system that has to expand. And there are other sources. I mean, there have been empires that were not based on capitalism and corporate expansion. There are whatever we call the former Soviet Union. There was a Russian equivalent that was not capitalist. But there is certainly a drive in capitalism and in corporate capitalism in particular, but also agricultural capitalism, for a control of markets, for control of investment, and in more than that, and even a genuine belief that this is a way to spread democracy, genuine, authentic, mixed with that ideology. You must go back to the base. The system that doesn't do this would be a system that is not necessarily based on expansion. So that's another way of asking the question. If you don't like corporate capitalism and you don't like state socialism, can you begin to get serious about non-expansionary systems? And you both change the nature of ownership and change the structure of the system so it doesn't have to expand. Actually, that's how I got into these questions myself. And we could get way into it. Also, the same questions involved in climate change and in resource use and in growth, systems that don't have to grow. If a big corporation stops growing and its numbers start changing on Wall Street, boom, its stock will be out, the management will be out, and the business will be out of business. That's the nature of the game. You have to grow out of either fear or out of either greed or fear. If you can't change that institutional dynamic, you are into an expansionary system which tries to control, and whatever you call it, that's implicitly imperial.
Now, in this cosmology, as you've been describing it, of worker-owned, I believe the acronym is ESOP, right? What does that stand for?
Well, that's ESOP is one form of worker ownership, and it's Employee Stock Ownership Plan. And it's a very American breed. Very interesting because it was put together by Huey Long's son, who was at that point chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, and a maverick corporate banker named Louis Kelso. And the way it works is very simple. Although basically, if you have started a company and your son or daughter doesn't want it when you retire, you have a choice to sell to a big corporation. They will probably take the productive capacity away from the city. You might make money on it. If you sell it to your workers, this is what they did. The law now gives a tremendous financial benefit to the boss who sells to his workers. That's a very, very unusual American thing, part of our maverick tradition. And the ESOPs, there are 11,000 of them and some 13 million people involved in these employee stock. They're a different form of worker ownership, many of which in the original stage were set up without voting power. So they're not democratic, most of them. However, there are reasons why they wanted to keep the financing under a trusteeship. But now what's happening within here, as you can imagine, as the workers get more ownership, they're beginning to break that down and get more direct formal and informal power, and some of them are beginning to unionize. So there's a trend within the trend. And so it's a very intriguing, I think of it this way. If you're in a country, a non-developed country, the real problem, the means of production is land. And you want to get the land from the landowner, you've got to bribe him big time or you've got to take it. So the way you do it is essentially to get the means of production, you give him a very large chunk of money if you can do it politically, or you take it. And what these are is another way to really find democratized capital with a major taxpayer financing.
Perhaps one of the better known of the international worker co-op efforts is based in the Basque country of Spain, Mondragon. Explain what Mondragon is and why is it significant?
It's a very, very interesting development because it's now roughly 85,000 at the last count of people involved in a very complex worker-owned set of co-ops that are integrated and operate very successfully. Everything from construction to supermarkets to high-tech equipment to the advanced research. These are not little co-ops. The rate of pay from top to the bottom in 90% of the co-ops is about 4 or 5 to 1, that the boss is only 5 times as much as the lowest worker. And in the biggest parts, it's 9 to 1. Now compare that with the Americans, 250 to 1 in most big corporations. And it's successful, and it's been very successful. It is running into the world market, however. This is not a part of a socialist plan. There's no state plan. It's kind of separate and grew up out of Catholic worker tradition and a Basque culture and a suppression by the fascist regimes, creating a very hothouse culture and Catholic social thought. A very interesting worker participation within, but it is now running into the world market, and that's a difficulty. It's looking for markets and it's up against competition, so there are some questions about it. Nonetheless, it has a great deal to teach us about how you can organize internally within co-ops and worker-owned companies, and many people are beginning this Cleveland discussion. Part of it, the Revolving Fund, has been drawn straight from Mondragon, and the linking of different co-ops rather than being just separate is drawn from that principle. Mondragon does not use the public or quasi-public ownership market, the hospitals and universities buying from it. That's not its design. It's problematic in some areas, but it nonetheless has a great deal to teach.
And explain what happens to the profits, if there are any profits. Are they plowed back into these efforts, or are they paid out to the workers?
It's critical because in the early period of worker co-ops and worker ownership, they did not make provision for this problem. And so if you pay out all the profits, what happens is that you don't have investment in new technologies and new equipment. So most modern worker co-ops have a provision that a certain percentage has to be plowed back into investment and new technology and research. Otherwise, you're going to fall behind. So most of them now do that.
I think a lot of people are very familiar with the going local movement. There's been a huge increase in farmers markets, in what are called CSAs, community supported agriculture, and food co-ops, all part of, all coming under this rubric of going local. But there's much more than just the food aspect to it, isn't there?
Well, it's very interesting that, and that's an allied kind of vision, I think, building around the notion of community, local community. So there are various forms of new currencies that are trying to break the hold of the dollar. Many parts of the country are experimenting with that.
I think Ithaca, New York has one.
Ithaca, New York is, and there's a big one. There's several parts of the country. There's a big one in the Berkshires where you can buy, and the local merchants will take these paper dollars and recirculate them to rebuild the local economy. That's partly what I was talking about in terms of when I say internal empire, I mean the cities are dying within different parts of the country, the local areas. And one way to do it is agriculture, another is small co-ops, another is these currencies that say buy local, increase the local multiplier. And notice that the vision there is communitarian. It's community, not simply worker ownership, which is a syndicalist model. It has a very different flavor to it. So I think there's going to be a mix of these two directions, and they have certainly political alliances are being built between the worker ownership model and the community kind of green model, and there's a lot going on at the grassroots level where these things are coming together.
You say the appeal of many of these ideas that we're talking about cooperatives, moreover, reaches across traditional left-right political divisions. What's the evidence of that, and where does the Tea Party kind of ideology movement factor in?
Well, at the local level, in some of the cities we've been talking about, Cleveland, but others, and I had a very strange experience recently because I was asked to come talk to the Chamber of Commerce, of all places, in one of the suburbs of Washington. And I was describing things like what's going on in Cleveland, where the worker-owned model and the hospitals buy from it, and they stable, and it builds up the tax base. And I point out the local small businessmen like it because it helps them too, more customers. And there's the Chamber of Commerce saying, that's fantastic, we ought to do that here. Everyone in the meeting, at this particular meeting, said, that's a great thing, why can't we do that here? That will help the community, it'll help the tax base. That's a good thing to do, it'll recycle money. And that same evening, I was talking to radical organizers in Baltimore, and exactly the same response. It has a way of speaking to different groups that, and again, it has to make sense. It gets beyond rhetoric. We're changing, in this case, the ownership of the means of production, if you like, towards a collective ownership structure that is worker-owned, and done in an intelligent way, it will help them and the community and people, even very conservative people, at the local level, not the ideologues, like the idea that why shouldn't everybody own parts of that this is a positive thing, not a negative thing, when you get down to the nitty-gritty. That doesn't mean to say the national ideologues have very different ideas and propaganda, and the Tea Party, you can find ideologues, obviously. It isn't quite clear where they break down on this, but the experience I've had, and experience of many people I know, is in many of these local areas, what looks to be quite radical, in fact, when done intelligently, when you've done your homework, makes sense to people. And it ought to make sense. If what people who care about changing this system want doesn't make sense, you shouldn't do it. So it's very important to understand that if you can't explain it to an ordinary citizen why what you're proposing is a better way of doing things in life, then you probably don't know what you're talking about.
But rational intellectual arguments aside that make perfect sense, still many people are not persuaded. This is a very entrenched economic system, and there's fear of change. How do you overcome that fear?
Well, I think what's changed in my lifetime is that the pain levels have gotten to a place where people now know personally, or in their family, or in their friends, or in their neighbors, something has to change or it's going to get worse. That's a big deal. When that happens in a society, that you get beyond talk to see the pain change, pain levels change, people have a different way of listening, a really different way of listening when everything else is failing, and you begin to offer both explanation and answers that might build, even if building over time, even if there's a long developmental process, even if that's necessary, it certainly makes you find people listen differently and talk differently because of the pain levels and the failures.
But given the extremis that millions are in right now, the unemployment, the foreclosures and the like, is there that kind of space in terms of time? Can we wait? What you're suggesting might be a decades-long process.
The answer is no and yes. That is to say, of course we can't wait. The pain levels are terrible. And there either is a path forward that we can make, or the pain will get worse. So it's an agonizing reality. I mean, it's a horrible experience that's going on. The society goes through the ringer as we are going through the ringer. And the choice is to try to build a way out of it or let it get worse. So, no, there's not enough time, and yes, that's the only way forward.
You mentioned ideologues, and George Will is certainly one such ideologue in the corporate media. He's widely circulated columnist. He writes about redistribution in extremely pejorative terms. To him, it's tantamount to a Stalinist gulag and a code word for a socialist takeover and elimination of so-called American freedoms.
Well, that is pure ideology as far as I'm concerned. There is a concern that a state can be too powerful. The conservatives were right to worry about a state that's too powerful. Fair enough. And very often liberals and radicals didn't take seriously the dangers of statism. I give them that, and I think we ought to respect that in genuine conservatives. But I did another book on this with Lou Daly called Unjust Deserts. If you look at the sources of wealth in America and in virtually all countries, overwhelmingly it is technological change that makes the difference. As to say, in 1790, if you go from then to now, one person could now produce 40 to 50 times as much per hour. That's where all the wealth comes from, this increase in productivity. Who gets to benefit from that? Everybody's working as hard is not a question of envy and greed. That's a social construction. And indeed, think of Bill Gates or Steve Jobs. They would have been nowhere, literally nowhere, without the internet. Who paid for the internet? Taxpayers paid for it. And the development of all the schools that led to the place where you could actually develop the knowledge for the internet. Who paid for that? The American people paid for that. And you can go right down the list and find that virtually all of what is modern wealth, that is the cream of which is taken off at the top, is a social construction. So that the source of what we're having is not some guy who did a wonderful thing. People did do creative things. Steve Jobs did do a creative thing. Bill Gates did do something creative. But their contribution is like a pebble on top of a Gibraltar of both taxpayer creation and historic creation of generations that created chemistry and physics and math, all of which, without which you couldn't do anything. Think of it this way. If the technological changes that come from both social processes and government processes continue at the rate they have been continuing the last century, in 2100, the income levels will be something like 7 times as much as they now are. None of which will have been due to the work of the people then, all of which will be the construction of taxpayer investment and social development and science and resources that they get to rip off then. They won't have done any more work. So most of what you see. So when George Will says this, it seems to me blatantly ignorant of the sources of wealth and who gets to control them.
Well, there should be perhaps a study on really existing capitalism, not this laissez-faire fantasy that is put forth in economics departments at Harvard and other learned institutions of higher education. You could add to that list of the internet that it was taxpayer money that paid for avionics, the jet planes that we were flying,
and most of the pharmaceuticals,
the pharmaceutical and all the medicine that was discovered, and vaccines at the National Institutes of Health. So there's this really existing capitalism, and then there's the actual capitalism.
Yeah, exactly. And the easy part is when you begin looking at pharmaceuticals, the jet airplane, radar, the sources of the computer. Bill Gates was on a contract at MIT when he first started doing this. All of the developmental work. That's one part of it. The other part is, schools and high schools and bringing the vast majority of the people to the level where they can actually create and invent is all social investment. So I think that's even more important than the easy ones to understand, like the computer and the internet.
I'm looking at the pie chart of where your income tax money really goes. It's the U.S. federal budget for 2010. It's published by the War Resisters League in New York. Anyone could access it at warresisters.org. What does this pie chart tell you about where money is going?
Well, this is certainly the military is a big piece of it, 30% on this chart. Past military, which means 18%. General government, 8%. Physical resources, infrastructure, 6%. Human resources, 38%, but that means Social Security and healthcare primarily, and Medicare, which are being paid for out of your very, very regressive taxes, of the working taxes. The actual spending, government programs are financed in two-way, federal government programs, and it's worse at the state and local level, which is used as sales tax often, have payroll taxes, which are Medicare and Medicaid, which is extremely regressive. That is to say, it's $108,000 now. Capped. It's capped so that anything above that just doesn't get taxed, which is amazingly regressive when you think about it. And then the income tax, which has gotten worse and worse and more regressive as time goes on. I'm obviously not a Republican, but I think we ought to go back to Eisenhower's income tax, because when Eisenhower, in the greatest American economic boom, the post-war boom, Eisenhower was president, the marginal tax rate for people at the top was 91%. So now it's down to 35, 37%, depending upon which year. So there's been a major change both in the distribution of income, which has gone, the top 1% has gone from 10% of the income to 23%. Now it's a little bit, because of the recession, down a little lower than that. Somebody lost that income, the other 99%. So, and then the tax rate went down on the top. We see Mitt Romney's been in the press the last month or two, which is he's being taxed at 15% because it's all investment income. It taxes working class income and worker income at 20 and 25 and 30 up to 35%. But if you make your money by investment, 15%. And it's wonderful to see an illustration in the national public. The economists know this, but now the public is being treated to the inside knowledge. Hey, he's only being taxed 15% and I'm being taxed 30%. What's going on here?
Worker Owners of America Unite was the title of the New York Times op-ed piece you wrote in December of 2011. You say a long era of economic stagnation could well lead to a profound national debate about an America that is dominated neither by giant corporations nor by socialist bureaucrats. It would be a fitting next direction for a troubled nation that has long styled itself as of, by, and for the people. What are the prospects of that vision being realized?
I'm a historian and a political economist. All great revolutions look impossible before they happen. That isn't to say great revolutions always happen, but it is to say, if you look at the folks who started the civil rights movement and up against the odds in Mississippi in 1930 and 40 of achieving a civil rights revolution were far greater. It appeared to the people at the time they would hang you from a tree if you made any kind of trouble. The odds, even in the Middle East, to break loose were greater than anything we face. The odds of the women's movement, the greatest cultural revolution in a modern advanced history, the cultural revolution of women in the last 40 years. I can still remember when it was not possible for women to be taken seriously in work, life, culture. That's a radical shift that looked impossible. It is not to say it's inevitable, but I think that a cool assessment from this historian and political economist is that it is within the range of reasonable possibilities that a transformation can be achieved, and that this next 2 to 3 decades is the prehistory of such a transformation. And in any event, all of the positive changes that would be necessary are useful to do no matter what. So I'm cautious on it, but I think there is a finite, realistic, and very much worth doing chance to build the basis of a next possibility.
You say your book, America Beyond Capitalism, is a toolbox of practical precedents that can be built upon.
Yeah, that's what I think is very important, to realize that we can get beyond rhetoric to things on the ground, thousands of things on the ground that the press doesn't cover, which alter the nature of the power base of most systems, who owns capital, and do it in a very American way. So I think there's a lot that you can work around companies, neighborhood corporations, municipal ownership, state ownership. 27 states have already owned shares in companies and take ownership positions. That's another interesting thing in America. There are state banks. There are many cities and many states now. I think there's something like 20 states that are considering legislation for single payer, and another 15 states are thinking healthcare, and another 15 states there are movements for state banking, public banking. So if you look beneath the headlines, and as the pain level grows, there are very real practical embodiments of a different idea, the democratizing of wealth. As I said, that's the prehistory. That breaks the idea system. That opens up a different debate. That's not the history of the next transformation. That's the step that's necessary, without which you can't get to the next stage, but it's very well underway if you look beneath the headlines.
Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.